Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Beyond Terrain podcast. I'm your host, Leah Dalton. If you're new around here, why don't you give us a follow or a subscribe? Be much appreciated. If you like the show, give us a review or comment, and always sharing is the best way to support us, and it would be much appreciated. Today, we have a fantastic guest, Dr. Joseph LeDoux. Very, very interesting work. This gentleman, he speaks very well. I've listened to a few podcasts of his, a lot of papers as well. And the listeners of the show might remember we discussed a little bit of his work with Emrys Goldsworthy. So if you want to go back to our first episode together, this was actually where I was introduced to this gentleman's work. So very excited to have him on. Really looking forward to this discussion. Dr. LeDoux, thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure.
So the first question I ask all my guests is sort of an interesting one. It's what is health? And you could take it in any direction that you'd like. What does it look like? How does it manifest? How do we become healthy? So I'll give you the floor and you can take it away.
Oh, you're starting with a hard question. I mean, it's a little bit out of my comfort zone there, but health is part of life, but so is disease, and so they're just kind of the yin and the yang of being alive. Everything that lives is going to suffer some kind of assault from bacteria or whatever is what else is going around in their world and their lives. So I think it's just, we all want to live in a healthy way, but we also want to live in a way that we enjoy. So, we may drink more whiskey than we're supposed to, or do other things that we should do, exercise more than we do. But, sometimes you just follow what you want and it gets you into trouble, or maybe it doesn't. So I like to try to stay somewhere in the middle ground of not too much of either way.
Yeah, well put. A little bit of balance. Uh, I would also include that, that enjoyment part of life as living a healthy lifestyle. If you're constantly depriving yourself of things that you enjoy and um like you said, maybe having some whiskey and maybe skipping a workout if you're a little tired, you got to listen to your body too and find
Yeah,
that balance.
yeah.
So yeah, I enjoy that answer a lot. um so in reading a lot of your work, I think central obviously is the discussion of the amygdala. um Not a topic that we've necessarily discussed in depth on the podcast so far. So maybe you could discuss a little bit about it, why you think that it's the fear center of the brain, um, and maybe give us a general overview of your understanding of the amygdala and its role.
Mhm. Well, but that may be a long answer because even though
It's
I'm
okay.
known for having helped make the amygdala a fear center, I do not believe that is an accurate depiction of what it does. What the amygdala does is detect and respond to danger. If there's a threat, you respond to that automatically, long before you're consciously afraid, right? So the fear itself is not something that the amygdala does. It controls the behavioral and physiological responses that are often associated with fear, but it is not what fear is. Fear is the cognitive interpretation of the situation you find yourself. So every person in every culture around the world has been exposed to some kind of danger. And we often hear that fear is a universal emotion, a basic emotion. But I think that's wrong also. So fear is not a basic emotion. I don't believe in basic emotions. Fear is the conscious experience you have, and the conscious experience you have is shaped by all of the experiences you've had over the course of your life with danger, and is contextualized by the culture in which you grew up. So while every culture has a language that has a word for fear, that you can translate across cultures, it does not mean that fear is the same across cultures. It means that the word is the same, but the experience of the emotion fear varies because of the cultural differences. Some cultures are kind of very skittish and afraid, others are more less so. And so it's just we grow up contextualizing all of our emotions in terms of the experiences that we've had with stimuli related to those emotions. But often in the case is the stimulus that you are exposed to that might elicit fear is not necessarily going to the amygdala and making you afraid. What it's doing is in parallel going to the amygdala to trigger behavioral and physiological responses that keep you alive, and simultaneously going to the neocortex and especially to the prefrontal cortex to allow you to cognitively construct the situation as one of fear because of the elements of danger that allow you to pattern complete the experience of fear on the basis of limited information, like there's something dangerous here. If you see a snake on the ground, you freeze. Um, you know that snakes are dangerous. Your heart is beating fast. So all of that is coming together into what's called a schema, a body of knowledge about what danger is that you've acquired over the course of your life. So your schema is the basis for your fear, and my schema is the basis for mine. So we may and probably do have different kinds of subtly different kinds of experiences of fear. Whereas the behavioral and physiological responses are often very parallel, often very similar across people, because those are hardwired in the amygdala when it detects and responds to danger. So we have inherited these hardwired states from other animals, but to a much lesser degree, we've inherited the emotions. You know, Charles Darwin was having trouble getting one of his books read by the British population because um, the British at that time, Victorian England, they were not very keen on the idea that we might have inherited things from animals like emotions. So they thought it was more important to take care of their pets than human emotions. It didn't like gel the way that it does for us today. He flipped things around. Instead of talking about humans as having animal-like emotions, he talked about animals having human-like emotions. Sort of flipped the whole evolutionary thing around. And that allowed his theories to go forward in Victorian England and for his books to become famous. But in doing so, he left a trail of misunderstanding about what emotions are. That he said we had inherited these emotions from animals, even though he talked about it as human like emotions, we inherited those animal like emotions to have human like emotions, which are kind of like animal emotions in his bizarre way. So you know, the field went down that road for over a century, still going down that road to the extent of believing that what we've inherited in the amygdala is the emotion fear, but that's not what we've inherited. We've inherited the ability of the amygdala to detect and respond to danger. Now, every organism that has ever lived, the earliest bacterial cell 3 billion years ago, or the most complex human being, these both have to detect and respond to danger. Bacteria have to detect danger, otherwise they can't stay alive. And they also have to be able to find nutrients in order to stay alive. So they approach nutrients and they avoid danger. So we think of approach and avoidance as very psychological things that, you know, it's a very complicated thing. No, it's as primitive as life itself. Um, but the psychological experience, which we humans have, and whether other animals have that kind of experience, we simply don't know. But we know that we humans have these experiences of fear and love and grief and anger and awe and wisdom and so forth. Um, so that's my take on the amygdala. That the common sense view is actually incorrect, and you know I've studied this for over 50 years. So I may be wrong too, but I've come up with a view over those 50 years that allows me to comfortably feel that I understand what's going on.
Definitely, yeah. Um, when I was sort of diving into this work, trying to understand emotions, what emotions are, was always a really confusing thing for me. Um, like, how do we process emotions? How do we think about emotions and feel emotions? It just all was very confusing to me when I was learning about it. It just, for some reason, we couldn't talk about it in a nice, like, logical, cut and dry way. Like, this is what we're talking about. Obviously, it's a very difficult thing to talk about. It is. There's no doubt about it. Emotions are a really interesting topic. Um,
I can
I'm
talk
curious if you
about it.
think
It's
that.
not, I don't find it hard to talk about
Yeah, no, you're very good at talking about it. Obviously,
it.
you're showing your expertise here. Um, I'm curious if you think that emotions can exist independently of cognition. Do you think that they're always intertwined with thoughts and perceptions and things of
Yeah.
that nature?
Yeah, I think there's no cognition, no emotion without cognition. Now, let me just step back a bit and
Please.
try to help you understand why it's important to think about, for example, the amygdala in this way. It's not simply an ivory tower kind of academic argument. There's a big reason for that. What the amygdala does is detect and respond to danger. And the assumption has always been that the detecting and responding to danger is because the amygdala is the seat of fear that drives those responses. So the pharmaceutical industry in the 1940s and 1950s, hoping to put Freud in the rearview mirror, eliminated everything subjective from mental states. They took the mental out of mental disorders. And the idea was that you could put a rat or a mouse into a behavioral test in a pharmaceutical company, give the rat a medication that will make the rat respond less behaviorally. And the assumption is the reason it's responding less behaviorally is because it's gone to the amygdala and made the amygdala less fearful, and therefore the rat is no longer feeling fear, as indicated by the behavior. So for the past the 1950s, the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, 2000, 2010, 2020, on and on. The search has been to use that approach to find new medications. The only types of medications that have ever worked are medications that were discovered in the 1940s and 50s accidentally, either mostly through studies of humans who were given a medication for some reason. For example, patients in a tuberculosis ward were found to seem to be happier when they had a medication that was supposed to treat the tuberculosis. It didn't help the tuberculosis, but the ward seemed more relaxed and calm, less depressed. That became the basis of antidepressant medications. The same thing with anti-anxiety medication. An accidental finding for some other reason, turns the medication into an anti-anxiety medication. So you have benzodiazepines to treat anxiety, and you also can use SSRI, serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. But that was known in 1963, 1964. And nothing new has come since. It's just keep trying to tweak the medication, give the rat a different version of it, do something different, but try new medications altogether. But the new ones don't work as good as the old ones. Sometimes they work very well in changing behavior, but they don't change the mental state of the patient. So patients go to therapists. You're studying to be a therapist, correct? Right. So patient comes to your office and says, well, I'm having problems with anxiety. I can't go to a party. I'm too anxious to go to a party. And so, if I don't know if you're going to be a psychiatrist or just someone who can administer medication, but let's say you were someone who could administer medication, and so you said, okay, I'm going to give you an anti-anxiety medication, and it's going to go to your brain, affect the fear and anxiety centers of your brain, and make you feel less fearful and anxious, and you'll be able to have a better time at the party. So the patient goes to the party and they're still anxious. The medications, but they find that they are a little bit less aroused, behaviorally aroused, physiologically aroused, and a little less kind of jittery at the party. But they're still anxious. So the patient is disappointed because they want to feel better, feel better in terms of fear and anxiety. And the pharmaceutical industry is disappointed because the patients don't feel better. But the patients go to you in the first place because they want to feel better. If you're just changing behavior and physiology, because that's what happens in the rat studies and the pharmaceutical chamber industry, you're not solving the problem that the patient needs to be treated for. Now, it's important to reduce physiological arousal and to reduce behavioral timidity, and make the animal less behaviorally inhibited, or the person, um, because those will allow then the therapeutic process to advance more precisely, because you're no longer feeling aroused and feeling jittery. The medications can help kind of tone that down. It's like you go into a restaurant in New York City, where I live, and often the music is way too loud, and you ask the waiter, can you turn down the music? Let's say it's some heavy metal song. I don't like heavy metal very much. And so I ask him to turn the heavy metal down. It's still the same song I don't like, but the volume is down. And so it doesn't affect me as much. And I think that's the same way with the medications. They turn down the volume, but they can't change your mental state. How is it possible you take a pill, goes into your blood, into your digestive system, goes to your bloodstream, finds its way throughout the body, finds the exact spot in the brain where it's got to like turn off the fear center, and all of a sudden you're fine? That's not the way it's going to work. Um, the medications have so many side effects because they go all over the body, and there's no fear center to turn off in the second place. So there's a huge problem in the industry, and it all goes back to the misconceptualization of what emotions are, what fear and anxiety are.
Wow, amazing. So when we're talking about when we think about trauma, how would you define trauma and bring that into the conversation here? Is it tied to this emotional responses? Is that's what being stored in the memory? Is that where we're
Mm-hmm.
we're looking for the answers?
Well, trauma is started out as a constrained notion, but now people have PTSD for almost any kind of thing. I had PTSD because somebody said something to me or something. But the real trauma, the thing that is traumatic, is a very, very complex cognitive, emotional, behavioral, physiological condition where you are under tremendous, tremendous psychological and or physical threat, danger, harm is in your way. You perceive a very significant amount of harm. You see bad things happening to other people. Consider a war zone where bombs are going off daily, every left and right spot. People live under trauma under those conditions. That's not the same thing as someone saying something you don't like. Um, you know, so that kind of serious trauma involves so much of the brain. It kind of takes over the brain. It involves cognition. It involves behavioral and physiological arousal. It involves memory. It involves just about everything of the body. So when we think of how can we develop a drug to treat PTSD, it's impossible. PTSD is a collection of symptoms, and if you have a problem that is so complex, you're not going to find one pill that can do all of that. What you have to do with a complex psychological problem is work on each kind of symptom separately, because each symptom is different. They come together and have the connectivity of something that we call post-traumatic stress disorder. But what it is going to be different for every person, because there are going to be different variations on the symptoms. So that's why in psychiatry now, there has been a movement to de-emphasize the names of mental disorders, because you can, for example, have you can be afraid of a lot of things. You can be afraid of having a heart attack. That's not a symptom of a heart attack, but it's something that can go along with having a heart attack, right? So you have all these kinds of threatening conditions. For example, schizophrenics feel threatened. People with anxiety feel threatened. People with depression feel threatened in one way or another. Threat is a common thing in many disorders. It's a kind of thing that happens. Because you feel threatened by your condition, basically, too. So these disorders are not things. They're things that we've named because it's convenient to categorize them. But the symptoms don't move, but they manifest across a lot of different kinds of so-called disorders. So if you want to treat a problem that a person's had, let's not call it PTSD. Let's say the person has been um, in a situation where something really horrible has happened, like an automobile accident or something like that. Um, then I think the therapist's job is to pick away at the component symptoms and not say that, we're not going to like erase the trauma. We're going to have to make the trauma less disturbing to you, less disruptive to your life. And to do that, we've got to change the behavioral and physiological responses in the person. That would be equivalent, metaphorically, that would be like taming the amygdala to calm down the behavioral and physiological responses. Step two, you would need to address all of the memories the person has, both the episodic memory of the trauma, but also semantic memories or episodic memories from the long past where you've come to understand what fear and anxiety are to you, what fear and anxiety are to you. So you have to kind of begin to change the memories of what fear and anxiety are to that person, not just fear and anxiety in general, but what they are to that person. So once you've tamed the amygdala and tamed the hippocampus with the memory changes, I think the patient is then in a situation where they're ready for talk therapy because you've gotten rid of some of the noise that gets in the way of the talk therapy.
Yeah, there's that big, you know, getting to know thyself piece, and if you're working with, like a counselor, or therapist, whatever, there's that attunement piece, trying to attune to the client's worldview. Even you mentioned, what does anxiety mean to the client? Like if someone is having anxious thoughts, what does that actually mean? Right now, you can kind of see how all of these things are based in, cultural factors, um, all of your experiences, what you were told in development, what these things mean. So tracing that back, and you're showcasing really well why it's so individual. We've
Right.
had some individuals on, and we've critiqued, the DSM, and it's limiting, right? It's limiting when you're talking about individuals, because it's best to speak of what happened to the individual. They're not a label,
Right.
right? They're not a label
Yeah.
there. Like they might be a manifestation of what happened to them, right? But again, the labels are they serve others other than the individual.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, because once you label yourself, then you've like acquired a whole new body of knowledge and information about who you are that is not useful, really, I think, to the patient. Um, there's just it's so complicated, and I'm not a therapist, so I'm just talking about all this from the perspective of what I know about the brain.
yeah, definitely. No, that makes sense. Like, um, I think that label piece is big, as you mentioned. Like even giving yourself a label, and then wearing that, because often you see individuals will carry this, I am a anxious person, or I am a depressed person, and then it's almost like another barrier
Right.
to get over when you're trying to heal, right? You're like
Yeah.
trying to, like, now first of all you got to break down that self-belief that you're a depressed person, because like you have to figure out what life could be if you are not a depressed
Mhm.
person. So it's very, I think that this is really important.
There's another thing I want to mention, which I think is also important. So going back
Please.
again to like when, the pharmaceutical industry was coming on, but at the same time, you had the behaviorists were still kind of in charge of psychology back then. So you had behavior therapy, which is based on, Pavlovian and instrumental conditioning. Um, and then you had cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy was developed by the by taking behavioral therapy and adding this cognitive component to it. So, but when that was done, that was good. But slowly the process changed because uh, in order for a patient to be reimbursed by the insurance industry, you have to have physical uh, objective measures, your checklist And so it becomes less about the subjective experience of the patient and more about the physical symptoms that can be measured. And so even cognitive behavioral therapy became more behavioristic over time. The mental is buried in there somewhere, but it's not the focus of the whole thing. I wrote a paper in the psychiatry journal, I think it was 2 years ago, calling putting the mental back into mental disorders. And it's the whole history of how this thing evolved with the insurance companies kind of merging everything into a measurable kind of condition.
Yeah, I've looked a little bit into that history as well, and what I've noticed is that we've moved away from serving the people, right? And you have to really have the heart um, to be in it for the right reasons, right? Because sort of the system is created. It's a system. There's, you could say it's good or bad or whatever. It's just a system, and that's how systems work. They need generalizations, and um, so that's why it's really important to if you are working with someone that they do have this attunement piece, that they're in it for the right reasons, that they're working for you as the individual. They're trying to go from your worldview and your culture. I think that the cultural factors are something that is beginning to be looked at a little bit more. Um, it's still we're trying to create a system around cultural factors.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to look at, this culture is how, you give this test for this culture and it's adapted to this culture, right? But it's,
Right.
you know, how does the individual even identify with their culture, right? Because, their family lineage might have done something slightly different and that might throw off the whole thing, right? So
Yeah.
that individual piece that we kind of keep coming back here to is really important. Really curious about your thoughts on, like, from your perspective, and your background, you know, can we approach healing the mental realm from our thoughts? Like, can you change your thoughts and then change, the way that you feel, right? Can you change the emotions if you could change your thoughts? Do you think
Yeah.
that you can approach it from that standpoint? And that's kind of the cognitive behavioral point of view, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Just curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that it is possible. The problem is that um, we live in a kind of internal narration, right? And when we think we're changing something, that comes to be built into our narration. Um, but the narration is not always that accurate. That's where I think the therapist can be very useful to kind of keep the benchmarks of how that process is going. I think I certainly didn't mean to um, put down therapists because I think most therapists that I know really want to help the patient. They have to play the game, of the so-called system you just described. They have to do that for the whole system to work and for them to make a living and for the patients to get help. But inside the session, they're there with the patient and are wanting to help. I think that part of the problem is that the the field has been so I'm going to use traumatized in this in this inappropriate way here. Traumatized by let's say that it's been bullied by the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry into marginalizing subjective experience as a real important factor. It's viewed as a kind of, I have some scientific friends, colleagues who do not like my views of fear in the amygdala and so forth. It's not in the amygdala, it's an interpretation. Um, and they think of subjective experience as the weakest measure of fear. It's the most unreliable, weakest measure. They're much more comfortable measuring behavior and physiology in the patient or in a rat. But it's missing the boat. I mean, the boat is the subjective experience. That's what's going to take you into the problem and out of the problem.
Yeah, well put. So, you know, in approaching emotional processing, um, again, in your expertise, how do you approach emotional processing? It's not, we're not targeting the limbic system here, right? We're probably targeting
Well,
other.
the limbic system is another one of my pet peeves. I do not believe in the limbic system. I've been
Maybe
I've been
we can
I've
go
been
into
on
that a
that
little
kick
bit.
since 1987, trying to get the limbic system out of the field.
I kind of thought that was going to be a little trigger there for you, but so let's talk about it. Tell us about the limbic system, what it is and
Okay.
what it isn't.
So the limbic system was a beautifully presented theory by Paul D. MacLean in 1949. This was right after World War II. Now you have to realize that during World War II, all research went into the war effort. So there was no research on the brain, no research on psychology, unless it was related to the war. All the money went into the whatever had to be done to end World War II. So as soon as the war began to end, and like 46, 47, it's kind of like winding down. Everything is coming back to normal to the extent possible, and research is coming back online. Not war research, but research on how the brain works. And what MacLean did was he looked back on the history of the pre-war research that had taken place. He included William James, Walter Cannon, the physiologist who questioned James's theory in the 1930s. There was something called the Kluver-Bucy syndrome in 1937, which was very important, where these researchers who had fled from Germany were now in the U.S. and doing research on psychedelics, actually, trying to understand how psychedelics induce. I think it was, I forget, maybe it was psilocybin was the medication they were using to try and understand how the brain generates these visual hallucinations. And they followed the visual processing in monkeys from the visual cortex into the temporal lobe, where there's a clear continuation of the visual system into the temporal lobe. And when they lesioned the visual cortex and then the temporal lobe, what they found was that the monkeys were no longer able to recognize things that were previously attractive to them, like certain foods, or they also couldn't recognize danger. So if they saw a snake, they would try to pick it up. Things had lost their psychological significance from these temporal lobe lesions. And this was the beginning on three kinds of areas of research that all really kind of have some roots in Canada. The first was Brenda Milner's work at McGill on memory, on patient HM. That was the discovery in 1956. The damage to the hippocampus and the temporal lobe disrupted the ability to form new long-term memories, cognitive memories. There was also a discovery that the other area of the temporal lobe that was of interest was the amygdala. It was discovered that those Kluver-Bucy syndrome conditions about losing the ability to detect what's good for you and bad for you turned out to be due to damage to specifically the amygdala in the temporal lobe. So that's how the amygdala and the hippocampus kind of got on board and became sort of the main focal areas of the brain for emotions over the years. So MacLean put all that together into a systematic theory in which the hippocampus was the core of the limbic system, the core of the emotion system of the brain. The amygdala was an output structure for controlling emotional behaviors and physiological responses. And you had this rim in the medial prefrontal cortex all the way into the back. The rim, we're looking at a hot dog bun now that we've opened up. And you see the white part of the hot dog bun. That would be the medial cortex when you open up the hemispheres of the brain. So in the medial cortex, you have this rim going around from the back of the brain all the way around the amygdala and hippocampus. And that rim, if you take the Latin word for rim, it's limbus. And so the circuit under there became the limbic system, the limbus system. So that is where that comes from. And it was said to be a circuit, a component of the brain that is involved in emotion, but not cognition. But right after MacLean proposed that, that's when the hippocampus became the seat of the most important kinds of cognition, memory, in the brain. Um, and so, according to the limbic system theory, that should not be happening. The hippocampus should be all about emotion and not cognition. And so, the no matter what you did with the limbic system, uh, it was it had a way out of the problem. Well, okay, if it's not the hippocampus, it's the amygdala. And the search went on to try and find, the amygdala and emotion and the hippocampus and emotion. And the hippocampus got left out and became cognitive. And so it was always like it was a shifting kind of set of criteria for what the limbic system were over the years. Um, but the biggest problem was in the 1970s, researchers discovered that the core foundation of the limbic system was the idea that this was a mammalian structure. It's what separated mammals from reptiles. And that's why McLean later talked about the triune brain, the reptilian brain, the mammalian brain, and the primate brain, three brains. But the idea was that each of those were new structures altogether. They did not exist in the previous kind of species. But then it was found that reptiles and birds have precursors of the neocortex in their brains, and it was found that that mammals have precursors of the so-called primate brain, the prefrontal cortex. So none of those turned out to be actually new. They were always there, just they weren't used in that particular kind of way. So it became a flawed theory, but it's still in the textbooks. It's still on podcasts. It's still everywhere, despite many, many legitimate scientists saying, this is BS, get rid of it. But it's still there. The amygdala fear center is a cultural meme. The limbic system is a cultural meme. The dopamine hypothesis of pleasure is a cultural meme. All of these things start out in science. They go into the culture. They become established as cultural truths. Then sometimes, this can take decades, right? So the amygdala, the dopamine is in the culture. All of that's in the culture. And then young people are starting to grow up, having learned about the amygdala. So there's a Batman comic book strip about the amygdala. You can find the amygdala in science fiction novels. It's everywhere in culture as the seat of fear. So those young people are growing up with that meme. They go to college. They get interested in science. They become neuroscientists. And they bring the meme back into science. So the amygdala is now, you can't, once the cat is out of the bag, once the meme is out of the bag, you can't put it back in because the people coming in believe it. And, people like me are old quirks, but what does that guy know? It's the amygdala is the fear center. So you can't erase these things that go out and come back.
Yeah, it truly takes a paradigm shift, right? Um, yeah, well put. Very well put. I'm curious about your thoughts on the implications of this understanding of the Olympic system. How do you think that it plays a role in how we understand emotions, emotional processing, therapeutic interventions, stuff like that?
Yeah, good question. So the point is that there is no limbic system, but there is a limbic brain. There is a set of brain structures under the limbus and that constitutes a limbic component of the brain, just like the neocortex is a component of the brain, but it does a lot of things. The limbic system does a lot of things. It's involved in memory with the hippocampus and the medial prefrontal cortex. Those are important for memory. It's involved in regulation of emotion. It's involved in self-processing. It's involved in a lot of things, but it's not something that works as a system the way the visual system or the motor system works. It's not a system. It's a set of structures that contributes to a lot of things.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah, that's interesting. Wow. Um, it's funny, you learn so much about the limbic system. It's amazing that it's still being taught in university curriculums, but if you understand the cycles of how that works as well, right? It really does take big shifts
Yeah, it's it's. I appreciate that you accept what I'm saying because not everybody in the scientific world is going to accept what I say. But I think it's the amygdala thing is coming along. I've been talking about the amygdala is not a seat of fear since a paper I wrote in 2012. And it's catching up. People are slowly kind of coming along to that. The limbic system, a lot of people understand it, are not talking about it quite so much. Dopamine is no longer as seriously thought about as the chemical of pleasure. It's more about a circuit, a system in the brain that releases dopamine and fuses synapses together when you're learning about rewards and so forth. So, I'm going to give you another story from Canada, which happened at a lot. So much happened at McGill. We would not have neuroscience today if it wasn't for McGill and the people who were there over the time. So, James Olds and Peter Milner. Peter Milner was the husband of Brenda Milner. They were at McGill at the same time. Everyone is under Donald Hebb, the kingpin of neuroscience. We wouldn't have neuroscience without Donald Hebb having been there and done all this stuff. Um, so in Hebb's department, all this stuff was happening. Brenda Milner was discovering the hippocampus. A lot of people, John O'Keefe, who discovered place cells in the hippocampus in Canada as well, working under uh, uh, Donald Hebb, and went on to live in England and got the Nobel Prize for his work on place cells. It's just been a tremendously important source of discovery that happened in McGill. I forget what your question was that took me there, but
No, you just had that was a little aside that you had a little story
oh
for
no,
us.
the Peter
Um,
Milner, the Milner, the story about dopamine. So
yeah.
these two researchers were there, and they put electrodes in the rat brain, and they thought they were putting it, like I think, in the hypothalamus, but they put it into the midbrain accidentally. They just they didn't have a good way to target it. So uh, Jim Olds, who was the leading researcher along with Peter Milner, uh, went on to move the electrodes around. When they hit one spot, what they found was the rat would press the bars incessantly to get electrical stimulation in that part of the brain. And when they took it out, they weren't in the midbrain or the hypothalamus. They were somewhere like around the hypothalamus. Uh, and what they came to understand was that that was reinforcing the behavior. That electrical stimulation was the reinforcement of the behavior. Um, Now, that was 1952 or so. In 1956, James Olds, the lead author on that work, um, published a paper in Science called um, Pleasure Centers of the Brain. Okay. If you read the paper in Science, there's no word of pleasure in the article. I'm certain the editors of the article called the title of the paper, put pleasure in the title to make it sexy. Um, Jim Olds got hooked on the idea and started promoting the idea that that the dopamine that the dopamine system in the brain was the center of pleasure. And then a guy in Washington at NIH, what was his name? I forget his name, but he came up with the Olds and Milner had the pleasure hypothesis, but not the dopamine hypothesis. Then this other guy, Roy Wise at NIH, got the dopamine hypothesis. And from the dopamine hypothesis came the dopamine pleasure idea. Now, both Olds and Wise, the two people who started the pleasure center and then the dopamine pleasure hypothesis, both recanted that. But again, it was too late because the meme was out in both cases. Yeah.
This is
That
like
was a little
the new
disorganized.
age
I'm sorry,
Thomas
but
Kuhn. No, that's okay. It's like like explaining it in these terms is I think is helpful for probably a lot of people. You could see very well how once it gets out into the culture, right? And that's exactly what happened, as you mentioned earlier, with the the whole dopamine depression or serotonin depression
Right.
hypothesis, right? Like
Right.
the deficiency in serotonin, right? It's the same thing that happened. There was no papers on the subject, but that was like the hypothesis, and the hypothesis got pushed out before there was any evidence. And still to this day,
Right.
people will still think that there is something wrong in the serotonin system, and
Right.
that's why they're depressed, and it's very, very interesting, once that meme gets out there, and um, even in science, they
Right.
want these titles to be appealing. They want them to get them, they want to click. They want people to read them too, right? So yeah, these
So it's like
oversimplifications.
one
Yeah,
one of the things I'm trying to do in our little discussion here is illustrate the importance of history in all of this, because students don't get enough of the history of psychology and neuroscience. And as many have said, if you don't know history, you're going to repeat it and make the same mistakes.
yeah. Well, we get one lecture at the start of the at the start of the course. Typically, you get one lecture on history. That's about it,
Well, that's
right?
good. It's better than nothing.
Yeah, I guess, but still, I agree. And yeah, my favorite quote about history is a Hegel quote. It's "We learn from history that we don't learn from history," and that's I think pretty accurate. But you're right. Yeah, having to delve in, especially in science. Um, one thing I find with research is it's can be sometimes narrow-minded, and now we don't really consider philosophy and
Yeah.
history and very important fields. I really think that we should take a holistic point of view when we are discussing scientific things. If we are going to be engaging in induction, right, we need to be acting as holistic as possible, and
Yeah.
I think that's really important. But
Yeah. I used
yeah,
to
I'm really
go ahead.
go ahead. No, please.
So I was, I used to be a big fan of philosophy. I read a lot of philosophy in my career, and I've been impressed with how philosophers are taught to think, but scientists are taught to collect data, and we don't have enough thinking. We don't get trained enough in how to think about things. Um, but now we're having a problem in neuroscience, especially in the study of consciousness, which is philosophers have taken their role too seriously, and they're beginning to do experiments. If a scientist does a bad experiment, they get called out. If a philosopher does a bad experiment, they're just kind of ignored because it's just philosophy. But there are a lot of philosophers now that are taking on scientific problems. And I'm sure you've heard of qualia in the philosophical sense, of what it's like to be conscious. It's not a physical product of the brain. Um, and so that's why he calls consciousness the hard problem, because if it's dualistic, it's not part of the brain, you'll never solve it. But he has encouraged neuroscientists to go looking for his hard problem in the brain. And so scientists are looking, trying to find this thing that he says doesn't exist, but they're looking because he's told them that it's in the brain. So it's very complicated. Um, and he's a very, very smart person, very brilliant, but his perspective is different than that of a scientist, and we do need some borders between the disciplines, because things can change in a bad way that way.
Yeah, well put.
There are a
Great
lot of
point.
theories like that are panpsychic, that consciousness is everywhere in the universe. So that has lots of implications. For example, um, there's always a debate in society about whether a fetus is conscious, but in panpsychism, even a rock is conscious to some extent.
Mhm.
Your iPhone is conscious. Stars are conscious.
Sure.
So that is that what we're talking about with a conscious fetus, or are we talking about the other stuff? I mean, how far do we go with these things? The other problem with panpsychism, it's one step from pantheism. If consciousness is everywhere, it's one step to God is everywhere, and that becomes the ruling law of the land, in a sense. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm really concerned about what's going to happen in my country next week with elections, and what the implications are going to be for the kind of just society that we had been working on for so long.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah, and for me, I think I think we need to take our power as individuals, do what we can, um, and I think that starts with healing. I think that starts with becoming the best version of ourselves, and um, yeah, I think that's really important, and that's why I think this discussion is so important. Um, Maybe I could get any final thoughts on the episode, anything about emotions, limbic system, anything that you want to add, anything that you think you might have missed.
Oh, I think I kind of covered it all.
I think we did
No,
all right.
I think I covered everything I wanted to say, and I really appreciate you having me and talking with you. I like your approach, and yeah, good luck with your podcast.
Appreciate it very much. Where can the listeners learn more from you, about you? How can they support you?
Okay, they can go to joseph-ledoux.com, and I'll be there. You can find have a dual career. I'm also a musician. I have a band called the Amygdaloids, and you can find the Amygdaloids on their YouTube channel, the Amygdaloids YouTube. Lots of videos, lots of music. I've got one video on there called Fearing. It's based on fear and anxiety and based on an Emily Dickinson poem, actually. It's got almost 100,000 views, bring us over the 100,000 mark by watching Fearing.
Amazing. Wow. Awesome. Awesome. Yeah, we'll put some links down below. I think that's so cool too that yeah, you're a musician too. I think that is such a very healing thing, engaging in arts and stuff like that. So, anyways, I really appreciate your time. I appreciate all the wisdom that you've had to share. Yeah, this has been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. I want to thank you all for listening. You should all know that this is not medical advice or psychotherapeutic advice of any kind. This is for your informational purposes only. But also remember that we're all responsible sovereign beings capable of thinking, criticizing, and understanding absolutely anything. We, the people and greater forces, are together self healers, self governable, self teachers, and so much more. Please reach out if you have any questions, criticisms, comments, concerns, whatever it may be. You can find me on Instagram. Really appreciate all your comments on the episodes. Really love chatting with you guys. You guys are truly amazing and you give some great support. So if you want to support us even further, give us a like, comment, a review would be great if you're on the podcast and platforms. Those are definitely great ways to help us grow, but sharing is always the best way to get this message out there. Let's remember, folks, that there are two types of people in the world: those who believe they can, those who believe they can't, and they are both correct. Thanks for listening, guys. Take care.